Hello and welcome to Rock Your Block. I am your host, Tia Young. Today, we're going to discuss the subject of homelessness in America, but particularly in Northern Virginia. Our special guest is the Executive Director of New Hope Housing, Inc., a nonprofit organization based in Alexandria, Virginia, and dedicated to ending homelessness in Northern Virginia. Under her leadership, New Hope Housing, Inc. has received many awards, including Best Housing Organization 2004 at the Virginia Governor's Housing Conference, and was selected as one of the 5 finalist organizations in the Washington Post's 2009 Excellence in Nonprofit Management Award program. Our guest was also named a 2005 Washingtonian of the Year and received the Center for Nonprofit Advancement's 2009 Gelman Rosenberg Friedman Excel Award for Excellence in Nonprofit Leadership. Please join me as we welcome Ms. Pamela Michell, Executive Director for New Hope Housing, Inc. Pam, welcome.
Thank you. It's
Thank you so
delightful
much.
to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Well, we have a lot to talk about today,
Yes.
so we're going to get started.
Okay.
In your own words, what is the mission of New Hope Housing, and what do you do to achieve this mission?
Our vision for New Hope Housing is to provide a home and a bright future for every man, woman, and child in our community. Our mission to do that is to end homelessness by providing home, shelter, and the tools to build a better life. Mm-hmm. We have some foundational values that are important to us. We believe that everybody is welcome. So we want anybody who needs our services to come in. We don't ask questions about what has happened in the past or where you live or et cetera. We want to treat you as a human being. So one of our rules for staff is we do not talk about the homeless. We talk about men, women, or children who are experiencing homelessness because it's a temporary thing, and calling people the homeless makes them sound like they're all the same, and they're not, just like all of us. Yes. Yes. And so those are some of our found. Oh, and this will also give multiple chances. Yes. We believe you don't get into homelessness in 30 days, which is the target for getting out of shelter. So if it doesn't work the first time, you get a second chance, and maybe a third chance, so that you can learn what we've trying to teach you. Get out. So
does that mean that someone maybe who had been living in the District of Columbia or Maryland, if they happen to be in Virginia, that they can, or do they have to be a resident of Virginia? No,
they do not have to be a resident. In Fairfax County, you do not have to be a resident.
That's very interesting.
In Arlington and Alexandria, it's a little more strict.
It's stricter. Yeah. Okay, that's good. Now, you have been the Executive Director for New Hope Housing for over almost 28 years.
Yes, ma'am.
Starting in 1990. So what was your field like then, and what was being done for homeless people at that time?
Homelessness has changed so much in my 28 years. Back in the 80s, when I started and then went to New Hope Housing in 1990, it was very much about shelter. It was about crisis intervention, keeping people safe, feeding them, putting a roof over their head, and often asking them to leave at 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the morning, and then come back the next night and stand in line. When New Hope Housing was never quite like that. We always provided more than just the shelter, and I would call us a full service shelter, but still our focus was on shelter. Mm-hmm. And it was on dealing with the immediate and trying to get people ready for housing. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was what all shelters did back then, is to try to provide people life skills, try to get them hooked up with mental health services, or get them clean and sober, or get them a job, et cetera. That's not the way it is anymore, but that's the way it used to be.
Yeah. Well, you know, we talked a little bit about this in the green room. I came to the area in 1976, and I didn't think there was any homelessness at all in this area. And I don't, listening to what you had said earlier, that wasn't true. We had it then, but we just didn't know.
Exactly. We got started because a woman who was running a local nonprofit organization, as she would say, the Holy Spirit whapped her upside the head and told her she needed to open a shelter. And because what she was doing through this agency was providing money for people to live in hotels, or stay in hotels when they were homeless short term. And she realized that was, an expensive way to do it, and really wasn't making any difference in their lives. It was just taking care of them for a night or two.
Right.
So she started a shelter program with a bunch of volunteers in the Route 1 corridor area.
Right.
Back in the late 70s, early 80s, volunteers were really about changing, making social change, policy
Right.
changes.
That's
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's true.
So that's how we got started.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Now, New Hope currently manages 6 shelters, 3 transitional housing programs, 9 permanent supporting housing programs. And then all of these house and shelter over 350 men, women, and children each night.
Correct.
And you provide something called homeless prevention assistance. What is homeless prevention assistance? What does that mean?
It is much better to prevent somebody from becoming homeless than it is to have them have to come to a shelter. So anybody who's got an eviction notice or who's on the margin and is housed at the moment can come to us, and we try to talk to their landlord, see what we can work out about possibly paying back rent or something, or find them another location that they can move to instead of having to come into the shelter. So.
How does that work with the outside organizations when you're trying to negotiate a better deal? Is that easy to do?
No,
or is it,
it depends on how behind or in rent or how much difficulty the person who's being evicted has had. Sometimes landlords just want that money that's owed to them, and then they will start over again. And sometimes they won't.
Right.
They really want the person gone, and it's time for us to find something else for them.
Right. What about people that are have been released? They've been formerly incarcerated, and now they're released. Do you help them, or
go back to my statement about we welcome everybody?
You
Absolutely.
welcome everybody. Okay.
Yes, we believe that they have done their time and they need a new start, and we don't judge people when they come in. It's helpful to know that, because when you're trying to house somebody, you may run into issues if somebody does a criminal history check or a background check and find it out. So we learn that in advance, so that we know what kind of landlords will take our folks, and what kind of employers will hire residents in the shelter. We personally, as an organization, believe that we should hire people who have experienced homelessness and people who have been in prison, because they deserve, just like anybody else, we should be doing what we want our employers and our housing people to do.
Okay. So is this a step process, like going from a shelter to a transitional housing to permanent support? Can you talk a little bit about how that works?
It's not. You can jump all around. Each of those levels, as it were, have a different focus. So if you are living outside, and we may need to try to get you to come into shelter just because that's an easier transition. But we have moved people from the woods straight into housing.
From the woods? We have people living in the woods?
Particularly in Fairfax County, we have people living in the woods, which is one of the big challenges because they are not seen.
Do they have at least a tent, or some of them?
Yes. If we know about them, they have a tent and a sleeping bag.
Tent. Okay.
Yeah, we have an outreach team that's in partnership with the county that goes out to try to find people who are living in the woods. And it's a pretty good, word of mouth of people will tell you, oh, somebody else living over there now, and so if you find one person, you'll probably find several more, because people will tell you where other people are living.
So are there children, families,
no,
or just mostly adults?
It's adults.
Mostly adults.
Yes,
okay.
Fairfax has basically has a law that says that homeless families cannot be homeless, so they will put them in a apartment, in a hotel if need be. So.
Pam, in your opinion, what has changed over the last quarter century for homelessness? Have things improved, or have they gotten worse?
Oh. In terms of numbers, the situation has gotten better. We do in the metropolitan area, we do a one-night count of all homeless people, and in, for example, Fairfax County, since 2008, the numbers have decreased after over 10 years by 46%. On the other hand, the shelters are always full every night, so people continue to come in. The big change has been that, as I said before, we focused on shelter. Now we focus on housing. The focus is you get people housed, that homelessness should be a temporary, short-term, not recurring. And so the focus is to figure out how to move people into housing that they can afford, and then provide whatever services they need to maintain that housing while they're in their housing.
Okay.
So we have what's called community case managers who go to people who we've moved into housing and work with them on whatever it is they need work with, whether it's budgeting or whether it's getting into an appointment, et cetera.
Okay.
So that's a huge change.
That is
it's a huge change.
That is a huge change. Now, you were working in nonprofits for a few years when you took over New Hope Housing. What brought you to the nonprofit sector, and how did you get this particular job? How did that happen?
My first job was federal government, and then I went to private sector, then I went to local government, and then I went to nonprofit. And I sort of like to talk about it as getting closer and closer to the people.
Right.
The job I had in the private sector was with the Washington Post, where I would go out and look at nonprofits who had applied for grants. And I was just really impressed with what I saw people doing on shoestring budgets. So that was sort of in my head. And then in the mid-'80s, I went to Africa. And I saw such amazing hope in what we would all think by the United States standards was just desperation. Yeah. And there was so much positive. So I came back and said, what am I doing that's going to help this? And homelessness just happened, but I wanted to do something. And so I volunteered with my church to run a rotating shelter program in the winter in Arlington County. And I woke up one day and said, this is great fun. I really like this, but I'm not a social worker, so what do I do? Yeah. So then I said, well, people need management in these kind of programs too, and I have that kind of skill set. So I started applying for jobs and talking to the people who I had seen in the nonprofit world when I was at the Post. And eventually I just applied for a job at the Washington Post, and I answered an ad.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you have people tell you you're nuts to leave your good government job?
A little bit, although they knew me well enough by that time to sort of not be surprised.
Right,
yeah,
right.
My values
and you've never
my
looked
interests.
back. I mean,
obviously after 28 years, there's something really rewarding about what I do on a daily basis.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it is
That's
really wonderful.
Story.
I like getting up in the morning still, and I look forward to going to work.
That's good. That's great. The next question I have, what are the best parts of your job, and what are the most challenging parts of your job?
The staff will tell you that when going gets tough, I go and meet residents. I just go and talk to people we serve and hear their stories, hear how we're helping them, hear what different staff people are doing. They always talk about how great staff is. Mm-hmm. And then I realized that all those things I don't like to do have a purpose. Yeah. And these folks are the purpose.
They're the purpose,
yeah,
and that's a mighty good purpose.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's time for a station break, but we will return right after these important messages. So don't touch that dial.
After leaving the military, some veterans may face homelessness, but they aren't alone in the battle. Thanks to a simple phone call, they can get help from a trained professional at VA. If you know of or are a veteran in need, call 877-424-3838.
Welcome back. You're watching Rock Your Block with our special guest, Pamela Michell, Executive Director of New Hope Housing, Inc. Pamela, what are some of the misconceptions that people have? For instance, you hear about Tent City, and I hear some really negative concepts about that, and then I hear some that are not so negative, and it's like that's put in a box, so to speak. So can you talk a little bit about some of the misconceptions?
Yes, this goes back to my thing about the homeless.
Yes.
There is not one type of person who is homeless, and the misconceptions include that people are mentally ill, people have addiction issues, people live on the streets, people don't want to come into shelter, people don't work, people are lazy, people, just all the not understanding and nobody thinks it's about people not having a home and not being able to afford a home. One of the challenges is that there's a group of homeless people who are much more visible, who have some of those challenges I just mentioned. But there's a lot of homeless people who you don't see, who go to work every day. And I have a staff person who, when she was homeless, she went to work every single day, and nobody in her office knew she was homeless. So and that people are isolated. We find, like all of us, that some people like to be with other people, and some people like to have their own little place.
That's true.
And homeless people definitely work. They don't necessarily get the easiest and the best jobs. That's one of the challenges. They get paid at the lower end of the scale, and they often work lousy hours, and often work part-time and don't have a set schedule, so then they don't get insurance.
Right, that's right.
So those are some.
And you are so right. I mean, in a way of somewhat of a personal testimony. I mean, not so long ago, I had a family of 5 in my household, and we had been living in a townhome for almost 18 years. And all of a sudden, the owner of the home was older, and the children had put her into a home, and they wanted to sell the house, and they wanted to give us less than 30 days to move out. And we had a senior member living, my mother, in the house, and had we not had friends and realtors and stuff to come to our aid, we would have been homeless.
Yes.
And everybody had a job, and nobody would ever have thought about that. But we came very close to not having a place to stay.
Exactly.
On that. So those misconceptions are horrible, and I'm glad that you brought this to our attention.
The other thing that what you just said makes me remember to say is that not all homeless people are single adults. There are definitely homeless families, and your child might be in school sitting next to somebody a child who's living in a shelter. And actually, until the last few years, families were the largest percentage of the homeless population in Fairfax County and in lots of places.
You brought up a question, another question I would ask when you mentioned about the schools. Do the schools work closely with you?
Yes,
for those
the schools are good. The schools, there is a federal policy that says any homeless child can go to their home school, wherever they were before that, or they can go to the local school, and that the government, the school system has to provide transportation to this new school, or to whatever school even.
Food? Do they help with the food?
Yeah, because of Title I, and the free lunch and free breakfast. Most of our folks qualify for that. So,
that's good.
And they have special people in the between the counselors, and they have some folks who specialize in homeless kids, and their special needs.
Right.
So they work with us about what we're doing, and actually the schools find it good when when kids are in shelter, because they're stable for a few months. Because they know where they're going every night, and they don't have to worry about their food, etc.
And so they
can work. Yes, exactly.
They can work better.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's good. That's good to know. We've talked about some of the misconceptions, but can you tell us some specifics about your clients, like some of the testimonies, the good testimonies, and maybe even some of the sad ones? Are you able to save everybody, or
no? Unfortunately, we aren't. Obviously, there are more positive stories than there are negative stories, because that's the only way I could work. Yeah. I couldn't go back. It's all negative. And one of the things that amazes me is what people who are homeless have gone through, and I wonder if I could, survive some of the things that they've done. One of my favorite stories is a woman we had for several months who wrote a poem that talked about what it's like to be homeless in the rain. And it's a whole different, rain, I think about my garden when it rains, or I think about getting my umbrella. And she talked about that, and it was just really very moving to hear those things. But I have stories about people who ride the bus 2 hours a day each way to get from Route 1 to Tyson's Corner to work in a job that they got before they came in with us. I have a great story about a woman who was like 56 years old, came to the shelter out of prison, and said, "Who's going to hire me? I'm an African-American woman, and I'm 56 years old, and I've got a criminal history." And she kept applying for jobs, and she kept getting turned down. And then one day, our employment person just sat down and said, "Okay, so what did you do before you went to prison?" And she talked about taking care of her mother. And her mother was aging, and now she's died, so she doesn't have that responsibility anymore. And he said, "Oh, that's a job. We could get you a certification in home health aid, and you could get a job." And we had a little pot of money for special employment needs, so we paid for her testing and certification. She moved out of the shelter like 2 months later. She bought a car. She is still out of the shelter. She is still working, and so people can and do change, and anything is possible if you stick with it long enough.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're talking about the resources. That would be one, is that you do help people, you try to help them find employment.
Yes.
What about other types of resources? Like, are there health things that you can do? Can you speak a little bit about some of the other resources?
One of the things about homelessness is, it really is an issue of housing that's not affordable and income that's not big enough. So there's a lot of focus on what people's income is so that they can afford the housing. But beyond that, there are the other things that happen in your life. So we have an employment person. He's fabulous. He has 2 jobs. He goes and finds employers who are willing to take a risk on some of our people who have felonies, who will take people who have a felony or who have a bad credit rating, et cetera. And then he also works one-on-one. like the story I just told you, with folks, helping them apply. He uses a bunch of volunteers because obviously a lot of our residents are very unfamiliar with the computer. You know, all job applications these days are online, right. So some of that kind of help. We have a partnership with the county. They send a nurse to the shelter once a week, and we have that. I talked about an outreach team earlier. The county has a nurse practitioner and a psychiatric nurse practitioner and a mental health worker, and our staff will go out in the woods. So it's a wraparound services. Mental health, we are hooked to the mental health. We hook people to the mental health system. Sometimes the mental health therapists come to the shelter and talk to folks. And the county now has a team that's called the Intensive Case Management Team, and they go to people's houses. So we have somebody in the shelter who we've hooked up with the Community Services Board, but we worry that they're not going to keep taking their meds and they might not continue to go to therapy. Those teams will go out and see the person in their home, back to that idea of not having to do everything in shelter, but doing it once you're housed. So there's a lot of partnership.
So is there age, like, what about seniors? I mean, do you have seniors in your program? I would say people over 60.
We do.
Is there a different process for them?
The different in the process for them, for the most part, is they're often likely to go to assisted living. Okay. Life on the streets is very hard. You age much faster. Okay. So, but we move seniors into sort of general senior housing, not assisted living, but like there are senior housing programs, or we have seniors who are living by themselves, or we do a lot of shared housing, like 2 people, 2 bedrooms, so it's cheaper.
Okay, good. How would you rate our community in their efforts to end homelessness?
It is a pleasure to work in Fairfax County. We have a great partnership with the county and the Office to Prevent and End Homelessness, and as I mentioned, the Community Services Board and the Health Department. The challenge, and where I would give the county a much less high score, is on the issue of affordable housing. We have just not preserved and developed new affordable housing at the rate we need to develop it at. And try as we may, it's not a popular thing politically, and so it's hard to get enough political support to make it happen, and it's very expensive. Developing housing is not cheap, and particularly to develop housing for people whose income could be 30%, could be 10% of median income. Median income is about $100,000, and so we have people who are making under $10,000, and how do they afford anything?
That's right. So housing, finding affordable housing is still...
Developing more affordable housing is probably the biggest challenge and negative.
Do you think it's possible for our community to end? I mean, is that possible?
Absolutely. End doesn't mean there'll never be another homeless person. End means that when somebody becomes homeless, we can rehouse them really quickly. And it'll last. It won't be a repeating kind of thing. Right. So we can but again, it goes back to we really need the housing piece. People think we need mental health treatment and all that. We need all that, but you're homeless because you don't have a home. Right. And so to end homelessness, you got to provide homes. So.
Pam, what are the best ways for people to get involved? And are you concerned about how much experience they have or what kind of education they have? No. Talk a little bit about that.
What we care about is that they are interested in learning more about homelessness and caring about homeless people. We have all sorts of volunteer opportunities because we're 24/7. And if you want to work in a group and be in the kitchen, we can do that. If you want to work one-on-one with somebody to find a job, you can do that. If you want to work with kids and tutor them, you can do that. You can help us fundraise. There's just all sorts of kinds of options. And for most of them, there's no prior, education or experience required. We train.
You just have to have a heart.
Yeah, you just have to have a heart. And I really hope that people who do volunteer will go out and talk about it. It goes back to the misperceptions. If you've experienced people who are homeless and can tell your neighbors that they aren't scary, they aren't drug addicts, they aren't whatever the misperception is, and that they just really need somebody to listen to them and to care and to provide them the resources that help them get out of the situation they're in temporarily.
Well, Pam, I want to thank you so much
you're
for
very
coming
welcome.
by.
It was delightful.
A lot. You opened our eyes.
I love to talk about this.
Us all something to think about. So thank you so much
You're
for
welcome.
coming. Okay. Thank you for watching today's segment of Rock Your Block. Eradicating homelessness is something that we can and must do. Organizations like New Hope Housing, Inc. are committed every day to make sure no one is sleeping on a sidewalk, an alley, or a parking lot. We salute these organizations for the selfless and outstanding jobs they do. We are indeed grateful to them for their efforts to put a roof over the heads of every man, woman, and child in America. Thank you for watching today's segment. We'll see you next week, same time, same place, for another great segment on Rock Your Block. Bye-bye.